Welcome everyone, Costini here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, and to talk about some of the things that I think Creative Assembly should do with regards to Thrones of Decay. Make no mistake on this, the controversy of Shadows of Change is very significant. I personally believe that Creative Assembly has to some extent realized just how significant it is, and they may already be taking steps to, well, rectify the situation, given everything. That's why we've gotten 2 hot fixes already. It might also have something to do with Baldur's Gate 3. But they certainly cannot treat Thrones of Decay the same way that they treated Shadows of Change. Now, whether or not it's acceptable for them to keep the price point, if they do a better job with the content, that's a whole discussion in its own right. Personally, I think that $25 for a Lord pack is a bit ridiculous when it's the same price as Race pack. What, are we going to get a significant increase with the next Race pack compared to Forge of the Cast Dwarves, or is Creative Assembly going to treat all these DLCs going forward, be it Lord packs or Race packs, at the same price point? Because that's one of the questions to ask about Shadows of Change. It's not like, oh, Shadows of Change is the same price as the Forge of the Cast Dwarves. Are they going to ask us to pay the same price? That's obviously a significant question that Creative Assembly does need to answer, and obviously we will get an answer in the next few months. In terms of the content, in terms of bug fixes, there are a lot of issues with the races in particular that Creative Assembly is going to target with the DLC. All of them need significant improvements, all of them need significant overhauls. Now, I spend a lot of time talking about the issues that exist for races, but I consider it at the bare minimum for Creative Assembly to fix the issues that exist. That they should include significant overhauls, like, say, a political system for the Empire, a new political system for the Empire, or a new crafting system for the Dwarves, as well as construction system for the Dwarves, similar to what the Chaos Dwarves have. That's a different discussion. But right now, when we're looking at Imperial campaigns, this is a campaign as Marcus Wolfhard. I've been playing it on my own. It's turn 12. And I'm playing it with your new Empire mod, which doesn't do all that much for Marcus Wolfhard. This is a mod that targets Karl Franz in a significant way, but doesn't fix the fundamental issues that Karl Franz does have. There are some mods that do improve the situation over there for him. There's also a mod that changes the way the hostility meter works for Marcus Wolfhard, in the sense that it gives you benefits as opposed to downsides. Because yes, losing 5 control, having enemy weapon strength plus 25, enemy leadership plus 10 is certainly a painful experience to deal with in a campaign with the hostility meter. Though, of course, you do have significant advantage, like Hellstorm rocket batteries at turn 12. That is pretty damn substantial, I gotta say. But those Hellstorms and cannons and grenade launchers are acquired by default. While this is a modded campaign, I didn't need mods to get those units, or even the greatswords. The crossbowmen and huntsmen that I have here, or rather the crossbowmen, certainly those are because of the warband upgrade system. So what does the Empire need? Well, the Empire needs a couple of things. As a race, it needs a better early game situation in terms of unit recruitment. Because if we look at the unit recruitment situation for the Empire does have powerful artillery, but they're locked until tier 4, because mortars are not really good in any way, shape, or form. So they're locked until tier 4, and it takes a very long time to get to tier 4. But once you get Hellstorms and Great Cannons, sure, you're in a pretty solid spot. They have good cavalry, but cavalry doesn't work that well in Warhammer 3. But the Empire certainly has some of the best cavalry in the game. Skirmisher Cav, Melee Cav, Demigryphs being really solid units. And the Empire can get a fairly decent infantry and ranged army with regards to greatswords and huntsmen. Handgunners have the issue that all gunpowder units currently have in the game, so that is a significant problem. But huntsmen, which are a DLC unit, and greatswords, which require you to get an armory, well, in the province you're recruiting them from, are decent. It is annoying that you are required to get an armory. Certainly there are benefits for doing so, but I think like that, if there's anything that needs to be changed, it's the fact that you do require multiple buildings to be able to recruit units, as opposed to just being able to recruit units. It's an old system that Total War has had its largely been removed for many other races, including the dwarves, because remember, the dwarves also may have required multiple buildings for units, but the Empire still has it. And it's still required for certain very important units like greatswords, as an example. The problem, though, with the Imperial roster, it takes a very long time to get any good artillery. It takes a very long time to get any kind of good melee infantry, so you're stuck using archers, again, DLC unit, and then crossbowmen for much of your early game, whereas your melee infantry, like spearmen with shields or swordsmen, are too weak and pathetic to actually hold their own in a battle. That is the problem, one of the problems that is created in Imperial campaigns, because you need to spend a significant amount of time, dozens of turns, to be able to get to a point that other races get in a couple of turns, or even start with. And it's not like Imperial campaigns are cakewalk. Sure, Marcus Wolfhard is easy, considering everything, though he does have that annoyance of a system. But certainly with Jan Bo, especially dealing with the Greenskins over here, though I would consider that a bit of a nerf in his campaign, because capturing this province for yourself would have actually been a boon. Jan Bo dealing with the Greenskins doesn't necessarily help you in a very significant fashion. But if you're looking at Karl Franz and the issues he has to deal with in his campaign, here I actually confederated Marienburg, don't ask me how I did it, just diplomacy being diplomacy, I guess, and sold the territory to Karl Franz. But Karl Franz has a lot of issues when you're playing him. You have to waste time in your campaign to get the entirety of the Reichland, and then which gives time for Festus, Kazrak, the Greenskins over here in the Black Pit, time to develop. And yeah, Vlad is an issue. Furthermore, even when you deal with those threats, you still have to wait a significant amount of time to be able to confederate the other Imperial factions because of Imperial authority. If it was just a question of diplomacy, that would have been one thing, but you have to wait until you get a lot of Imperial authority, and you have to wait until you get a lot of fealty. And your diplomacy options with these factions are very limited. It is a very different affair when you are not playing an Imperial campaign, where the Imperial campaigns between each other do actually have all the entire range of diplomatic options. Confederations, military alliances, I've certainly seen them. So the Empire actually is better when it's controlled by the AI and you're not playing an Imperial campaign, especially if you're not playing Karl Franz or Balthasar Gelt. And Karl Franz and Balthasar Gelt do need to be improved. Imperial authority needs an overhaul or a complete removal. Yes, the previous system that existed before Imperial authority would actually work better at this point. Though I think some kind of global system where Karl Franz is fighting for the sake of the Empire is fine, it's suitable, but the way it's currently handled just doesn't work well within the context of Warhammer 3. Different situation in Warhammer 2, but translating a system to Warhammer 3 from 2 doesn't necessarily end up working in the best possible fashion. For Volkmar, his situation is, well, he starts with a province that isn't so great, where he has a lot of limitations. In that province, he has to deal with some very difficult early game battles, and even when he deals with Manfred, it's not like things are necessarily going to get easier. Tic-tac-toe is a constant thorn in your side, the Lizard, and potentially even Krokar, and then he has Arkhan to deal with. So it ends up being a fairly brutal campaign if you're playing as Volkmar. What's really bad about the campaign as Volkmar is getting the Books of Nagash, which you really want to do, because the main power that Volkmar has in his campaign comes from the books. He gets a lot of benefits from the books, but he has to do things like, go take the White Tower of Hoa for whatever reason. At least with the changes to the AI, it does seem like Safri is not going to be conquered every single time by Tyrion and Alariel, so you don't have to necessarily fight Tyrion, but you still need to go all the way to Ulfwan, or to take Carrick 8 Peaks, or those kind of things. And you end up having to fight factions that really should be your ally. And you can make alliances with them. And look at how they handle things with the Cast Dwarves. In the Forge of the Cast Dwarves, Realms of Cast campaign, you do need to get those artifacts, those Dwarven artifacts, but you can get those Dwarven artifacts that are in settlements by military alliances. You can't do so with the Books of Nagash. A similar situation, by the way, exists for Forik, where Forik can get the artifacts from military alliances. So that campaign dynamic that they have is significantly better. That's what needs to be changed for the Empire at the bare minimum. Better campaign mechanics that aren't frustrating and annoying, better unit recruitment options early on in a campaign. Even if you do limit the recruitment of artillery to tier 4, all that, like I think Marcus Wolfart himself shows you how you can have that while not giving the player the power that comes with recruiting high tier units very quickly. Because, yeah, I have a Hellstorm and a Great Cannon, but I only have one. It's not like I have a lot of these in my campaign. And I have to be careful with them. So I think a similar system would work better in a different, obviously a different system, but with a similar result, if you will. People have talked about Crusades, they've talked about Prestige. There are possibilities, there are things that Creative Assembly can work with if they decide to do so. That's what I consider as a bare minimum for the Empire. Also, overhauls for their lords and heroes, because while the warrior priests are okay, the the generals of the Empire are not. They're lacking in a significant fashion in a lot of ways. They don't have a special skill line. They're not that great in battle. And when we're looking at the heroes, Imperial captains and witch hunters do leave a lot to be desired. So the heroes of the Empire and lords of the Empire do need better skill lines. Huntsman generals do have that kind of skill line, so they don't necessarily need it. If you're looking at the Arch-Lectors, that's again a better situation, because Arch-Lectors do have all those spells, all those abilities, but they do need better combat capability in terms of their early game, in particular, better situation with their lords and heroes, and just better recruitment in general. That's what I would consider, again, as a bare minimum. What I would like to see is some political overhaul, if you're playing Balthazar Gelt or Karl Franz. And I certainly hope that with the Empire or any of these races that we don't get a situation similar to the Changeling, where they make a really unique campaign and he's really powerful and it works. He is atrocious to play, or rather boring to play in his campaign, because it ends up being a cakewalk. But they leave Kairos in dust. That's the kind of situation they really should avoid with Thrones of Decay. And there are dwarves, and the dwarves are in a fairly sorry state in Warhammer 3. Weak growth, weak casualty replenishment, limited recruitment slots, like you can only recruit 2 units by default with the baseline unit recruitment slots. You can increase it, of course, to 3 with Masters of Steel and Stone, but it's just a combination of the issues that the dwarves have. Like, you have really poor growth, because the way growth works for the vast majority of races is that it's reliant on the main settlement building. For the dwarves, the growth from the main settlement building is pretty damn pathetic. What's even worse is that if you have poor control in a province, you might be in a negative growth zone. That is a pretty significant issue. On top of that, the post-battle loot that the dwarves do have, which is a way to make do in a campaign where you don't have a good economy, like Kislev, having good post-battle loot is something the dwarves also don't have. Their post-battle loot is actually pretty pathetic in a lot of ways. So it's a combination of factors. On top of that, the units you want to use in a campaign are ultimately going to be, like with the exception of a Slayer army for Ungrim, only because it's a mod that I'm using here, it's something similar to this. And I only recruited Dwarf Warriors and Giant Slayers because, well, I was kind of in a hurry here. But really, it's something that comes down to using a lot of Quarrelers, using Grudge Throwers, and that's it. It's the best army you can use in a campaign. You might upgrade the Grudge Throwers later on, but you're never going to stop using Quarrelers. So it is very, very boring to play the Dwarves. Rangers do work, to be sure, in a campaign, though Quarrelers are quite good, will make it work for a very, very long time. As for Ironbreakers, maybe a couple of them, but again, your army style, your play style is incredibly limited. And limited growth also means limited heroes, limited economy, limited choices in a campaign in terms of the units that you can recruit. There are mods that do improve this situation, to be sure, but mods shouldn't be mandatory to be able to have a decent enough time with a race. And these are just issues. These are things that Creative Assembly, if they really, really wanted to understand how annoying this is, or the grudge meter and all that, all of these kind of things could be things Creative Assembly could update in a patch if they wanted to. We're not talking night and day differences. You're telling me that say, doubling the growth on the main settlement building for the dwarves, which they could really use, or in the case, the mod that I'm using is giving me income from all buildings in the province, is something that would require a significant amount of effort when modders have been able to do it with 1 or 2 modders have been able to do it very easily in the mods they have. No. This, like, all of the things I talked, like casualty replenishment, issues of growth, limited recruitment slots, a bloated research tree, and so on and so forth. All of these things can be and have been fixed by mods. Now, I take the personal view that mods should be an improvement, sure, or give you a different kind of playstyle to the vanilla game, but the vanilla game should not be broken. And it does seem to me that Creative Assembly, for the Empire, for the Dwarves in particular, they do know that these races are incredibly popular. Now, if they absolutely don't fix anything for the Dwarves, then again, I consider it a minimum to fix these issues. I think to make the Dwarves interesting to play, they do absolutely need the resource system, minus the laborers, from the Chaos Dwarves. That is my perspective on the matter. I'm sure there are other ideas, like people have talked about using the Underways, all that kind of stuff. And speaking about the Underways, the Dwarves should kind of be more similar to the Wood Elves. Now, there's a lot of issues with that in the context of a campaign, because the Wood Elves end up being boring, but the idea that the Dwarves have to occupy a significant amount of territory to make their campaign work kind of goes against what the Dwarves actually do in the lore. So the Dwarves should be about, like, connections between the major dwarf halls, so Karzak to Slayer Keep. Just some examples, and maybe a lot of underway fighting to secure those transport routes between various Karks. That would be the essential dwarf experience in a way. How they would implement that, just gonna keep this in mind, how they would implement that within the context of Warhammer 3 without it being boring is a different discussion, but that's just one of the things to mention. The dwarves are also masters of trade in the lore and master craftsmen, and yes, you can craft things for the lore. It's, however, a very exploitable system that Creative Assembly has not bothered to fix in any way. And maybe they should fix and improve the system. There's a lot of potential they could do with dwarves. Also, the grudge system is not a great system because it's very easy to get grudges with a particular race. Let's say Vlad is raiding my territory here. He will, and I'll get a grudge against the vampires. Not against Vlad, against the vampires. I think, like, grudges should be more specific. If one specific faction wrongs you, well, they wronged you, not their entire race. And because the problem with racial grudges is that the people who raid you, for instance, might get wiped out, and you're left in a situation where you have to deal with a grudge, and, well, the guys who committed the grudge are dead. Just some examples over there that need to be improved upon. And yeah, a reason to use a wider variety of units. Casualty replenishment would help with that. Changing the research tree would help with that. More recruitment slots, or the possibility of increasing those earlier, could help with that. That's where I stand on the dwarves. And finally, Nurgle. And finally, there is Nurgle Kugath. Now, with Nurgle, I would possibly expect Creative Assembly to do what they did with the Changeling, which is make a campaign with completely different mechanics that resolves the issue the race has inherently, but not do anything to fix Kugath. It would not be a great situation if they decided to go with the Changeling 2.0, especially because of the issues the Changeling has in his campaigns. I mean, he's powerful, but that doesn't mean he's great. Different discussion. Now, what's the problem with Kugath? What's the problem with Nurgle? Well, the unit roster, the baseline unit roster, is pretty freaking terrible. You can make it work with the Champions of Chaos DLC, but great, we need to own a DLC to make a race work in any way, shape, or form. That's the first problem that Nurgle is going to encounter. The second issue is that structures are incredibly expensive. You don't have trade, you don't have a good amount of baseline income, your income varies depending on the stage at which buildings are at. Having varied income is a really, really horrible thing to have in a campaign, because it means your empire, your nation building, is just not reliable at all. So you go from 50 to 500, you might understand the issue this creates in a campaign. It ends up being a fairly substantial problem when you add it all together in a Nurgle campaign. And yes, the default unit roster does leave a significant amount to be desired. Only really good with the Cast Warriors of Nurgle, Marauders of Nurgle, etc. Whatever units they add in the DLC hopefully will help the roster even further. But really, the other problem that Nurgle does have is also with unit recruitment, because the way unit recruitment is handled in a Nurgle campaign, the way unit recruitment is handled in a Nurgle campaign is you construct either a basic military building or an advanced military building. An advanced military building is 10,000. Now keep in mind, you're strapped for cash in a Nurgle campaign as is, even if you didn't have the highest construction costs from the very beginning of your campaign, of any campaign in the game. And it takes a lot of turns for that to pay off in any way, shape, or form, because you're going to have to wait. Like, it's going to take 4 turns, and 4 turns, like just looking at the Living Tree of Decay, like you're looking at waiting 4 turns, 12 turns, 16 turns, 20, 24. You get the idea, right? It ends up being a significant amount of time until you start getting some really good units. And even when you get really good units, you're not getting a significant amount of them. Like, you get 1 Cast Fury, 2 Cast Furies, then some Rat Flies, 2 units of Rat Flies, 1 unit of Cast Knights, 1 unit of Plague Drones. And eventually, you just get 1 unit of Chosen with Nurgle, 1 Plague Drone unit, and another Chosen of Nurgle. So that's all you would get for the entire cycle with 1 building. Now, this does mean that with a lot of buildings, it does end up stacking up. So with a massive empire as Nurgle, it could work, but building that massive empire, have fun with that. You can't trade. Your post-battle situation is also a problem. Because post-battle, right? Looking at that situation, you can either go for money or you can go for infections. Now, infections are a pretty important aspect in a Nurgle campaign. Without infections, you can't use the plagues. And you do want to use the plagues. You want to get the Black Plague, at the very least, for 100% income from sacking and loot in some settlements in the local province. You want the various benefits that these plagues will provide. If you're going to have any kind of chance in a campaign, but you have this dynamic where you want to use a lot of plagues, so you want to get a lot of infections, but similarly, you also need a lot of money when you're playing a Nurgle campaign. So the campaign dynamic ends up being pretty broken. I think the cycle build, like Nurgle is probably the ultimate example of how Creative Assembly, with Realms of Chaos, had a bunch of good ideas in theory, or they had ideas, they may have worked in a different kind of campaign, but they don't work anymore. Now, you do have global recruitment, to be sure, as Nurgle, and it can end up being powerful, though it is a recruitment system that they took from Thrones of Britannia, with all the implications that they're in. Now, I find the idea of the system they have to be solid enough. The execution, however, Nurgle is just too damned weak as a race at the moment. You end up not being able to recruit even basic armies for a very, very long time, with the exception of Nurglings. And even Nurglings are limited resource, and they're very easy to lose. Like, you have limited armies, limited economy, limited buildings. The only thing Nurgle has going for him is the fact that you can get an enormous amount of hero capacity with every kind of resource type. So a tier 1 resource building, which is really cheap, will increase your hero capacity for all your hero types. You do need to get to a high level settlement building, or rather provincial capital, to recruit them. But when you do, you get those resources, like you do start with 2 resource buildings in your initial province, but when you do, you can end up with a ridiculous amount of heroes. Like, looking at Kugaf's starting situation here, he's got 2 resources in his initial province. He's got another one available in Pig Barter over here. So that's free hero capacity that he could access relatively quickly. And obviously you always start with 1 hero capacity, so you're looking at having 4 heroes of each type. 5 with the marble that's in the Sentinels, assuming you're capable of defeating Trasov. So there is power available in some way, but not having an army, not having buildings, being limited. Also, what's even worse with Nurgle is the way some factions make do with money is that they go to other factions and they trade they trade settlements. Here's the problem though. Nurgle's buildings are so unique that you can't do that. Like, when you take over a settlement, you'll have to, like, unlike many other races, you'll have to basically build everything from scratch. So that significantly higher building cost that you have to worry about is actually far worse for Nurgle than it would be for other races, because other races, they have lower costs, and when they take over province from many factions, they may get a lot of their buildings, so they don't have to waste time constructing things, time and money constructing things from scratch. You do, with the exception like resource buildings, but you do need to construct things from scratch. And it ends up being a major issue. And when it comes to selling buildings to the AI for money, one of the problems that exists because of that, the AI is going to value buildings that have structures, specifically military structures, is something the AI does care about a great deal in terms of valuation. The AI cares far less for buildings that, for settlements that have no structures in them, just the main one. So if you're looking to sell buildings, and selling buildings isn't just like a minor affair for Nurgle, because you can vassalize factions for diplomacy, but you're really going to struggle with doing that. This is genuinely the worst campaign, because when you add all of everything together, like individually, these would be pretty big issues, but together, they're game-breaking issues that screw over Nurgle in a lot of ways. And Tamarkand needs to be a lot better. Now, I admit I would care far less if they left Kugaf in the dust than I would care if they left the entire Imperial Legendary Lord roster and entire Dwarf rosters in the dust, to be sure, but this is not acceptable, Creative Assembly. Flat. Now, they could lower construction costs for buildings, they could allow you to transfer, like, maybe having a very low cost would, like, if buildings cost very little, that would actually work for Nurgle. I mean, you'd still need to wait anyway a lot of turns to get to make these buildings work in the first place. Having buildings that may cost nothing even would vastly improve Nurgle's campaign in a lot of ways, because you would still need to wait. It's not like, oh, you just construct buildings, you gain a lot of power. No, the power comes after many, many other turns. That's the downside. Like, there's a lot of downsides, very few upsides, and those need to be changed. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. I think that if Creative Assembly doesn't resolve these major issues, at the bare minimum, I might add, not as what they should do, but if they don't resolve these issues, and if they ask the same price or even higher, they're potentially going to kill their own game. And I do agree with the sentiment that Legendary of Total War posted in one of his videos. He took it from Reddit. No one won with this. Like, no one that cares about Total War won with Shadows of Change. Not Creative Assembly, not the community. The only people who won are the people who are just trolls, basically. Those of us that do care about this series, have played it for a long time, there's no victory for the fact that Shadows of Change sold poorly. Not for us, not for Creative Assembly. Unless Creative Assembly changes things, and even then, what the Pyrrhic victory of that would be. But I guess sometimes you do need the company to be smacked around pretty hard for them to realize this is not acceptable. And Creative Assembly has certainly been one of those companies that has needed that multiple times in the past. How many more times will this have to happen? Do we need another Rome 2 situation? Do we need another Empire situation? I hope not. I really hope we don't go for that. But it seems like a lot of the times with Creative Assembly, when you hope that they will do better and you expect them to do better, that they just abuse that and they do a really crappy job. And they only do things good in a good fashion when they're under significant pressure from the community. That's my perspective on this. Stay tuned for more.